1944, Nijmegen. The basement air tastes of cold stone and sweat. Hanging bulbs swing slow, casting a sickly yellow over blankets folded into rough rows. Wooden stretchers creak. A nurse's armband, frayed at the edge, rests against a coil of bandage like a quiet signal amid the noise. A medic kneels, fingers steady on a pale wrist, an ampule of morphine balanced on a tray nearby. The sound outside is distant now, shelling like a failing drum, and inside the church the world narrows to breath and cloth. Before this night ends, a single photograph will force a medic to choose between his oath and his orders. A crumpled photograph slips from a coat pocket and flutters across the floor. A child's smile looks up from the crease. Behind it, a name scrawled in a hurried hand. Evelyn picks it up as if by habit, folds it once and feels the paper tremble. The man on the pallet is an enemy soldier, eyes half closed, lips blue with cold. He's the enemy. He's a patient. No priority. Evelyn closes her hand around the photograph and lets her thumb smooth the fold. She looks at Andre, the medic tensing to move. She nods almost imperceptibly, reaches for the armband, and the sound of boots on the stairs cuts through the room like a question. Mercy, where hate was expected. In a ruined church beneath a city under fire, a frayed armband and a crumpled photograph become the pivot of a choice no patrol order can dictate. Evelyn's fingers on the paper, Andre's hand over a pulse, and the slow hiss of morphine ampoules. These small motions stand between protocol and compassion. The question that will follow them out of Nijmegen is simple and stubborn. When duty and humanity point different ways, which do you follow? This is not a tale of banners or strategy. It is a close study of a moment when medicine must answer for itself, quietly, in the dark. Would you risk a reprimand to save an enemy if it meant breaking protocol? If stories of courage under oath move you, consider subscribing. Evelyn feels the armband tighten against her wrist as if it were another pulse to be read. Andre glances up, eyes shadowed, measuring time the way a surgeon measures blood, by the thinness of moments left. A stretcher skids. Someone curses softly in the doorway. Outside, the city argues with itself in bursts and then hushes. Inside, each small decision is a ledger item. One ampule used here is one less for a friendly patrol. One blanket given away is one less for the next shock patient. They count losses in breaths. For now, their ledger will list a child's photograph, a borrowed ampule, and a quiet, deliberate choice to keep a life on the other side of the line. Nijmegen, September, 1944. The city was a hinge in Operation Market Garden, streets still booby-trapped with rubble, and the air threaded with distant artillery. In that week, a church basement became, for days on end, a field hospital. Not a polished ward, but a patchwork of blankets on stone, lamps hung from joists, and a handful of medics and nurses working on adrenaline and rationed supplies. Evelyn Hughes was one of the senior nurses who turned sermons into stitches. Andrzej Kowalski arrived with a small detachment of Polish paramedics, hands that had learned wartime improvisation in another country's trenches. Their task was simple in description and impossible in practice. Receive the wounded, stabilize them, sort by urgency, and send them on when transport arrived. Triage here measured not just wounds, but logistics. Where a bandage was spent was an admission against future need. The risks were immediate. Shelling could reopen the roof at any hour. A stretcher could be delayed by checkpoints. A friendly convoy might be ordered away. Within that pressure sat orders and doctrine. Prisoners were often to be processed separately, and commanders insisted on priorities that favored the fighting force. There was also the thin international language that hovered in the room. The Geneva Convention as moral backdrop more than a script, reminding those who tied bandages that a wounded human was, under law and under oath, a patient first. But law and command lines did not stop the quiet calculations about morphine ampules or who would take the last blanket. In practice, medicine at the front was a braided decision of ethics and necessity. A nurse's armband marked authority. A medic's oath marked a promise. When a dying man lay half in shadow, these marks could point different ways. The choice the team faced in Nijmegen was not theoretical. It was a timekeeping of small mercies and withheld orders, and it came down to a simple statement they would carry with them. Oath over orders, mercy over propaganda. They come in small waves, carried on wet canvas and the clatter of boots. Andrei's detachment hauls a stretcher through the low doorway, faces streaked with soot, breath visible in the cold air of the basement. Apara's jacket is buttoned wrong, cuff singed. Someone hums an old Polish song under his breath as they lower the wounded onto blankets. Near the back, pushed under a broken pew, a coat is left half open. The man inside is pale, clothes muddied, hands curled as if around something too small to keep. A photograph slides free and flutters like a small white flag. One of the Poles looks down and says, "Left him here." A corporal by the door answers without looking up. "We tag and move." Priority to own. Evelyn bends and, without thinking, tucks the photo into her pocket. She does not read it yet. The habit of caring is faster than the habit of labeling. In the immediate hurry, triage becomes the language everyone understands. Evelyn moves between stretchers with the economy of a woman who has learned how to make decisions that must hold for more than one life. She marks a ragged card, lifts a bandage roll, and counts morphine ampules aloud to herself so she will not be surprised later. Someone wheels in a wounded officer whose breathing is steady. A child, no older than a teenager, sits shaking in a corner, clutching a canteen. The man with the photograph lies half out of sight, and Andrei, wiping hands on his trousers, checks a pulse that is faster than it should be for sleep. "Pulse," he whispers, weak but present. "Then he's not for holding," Evelyn replies, thinking of stretchers waiting outside and of orders that speak of processing prisoners separately. Triage is a clinical ledger and a moral ledger at once. Numbers on cards decide who will get the spare bandage, which arm will receive the ampule meant to quiet the worst of sensations. Giving anyone attention here subtracts from the store of possible futures for someone else. The photograph in Evelyn's pocket weighs as much as any item on the supply list. It is a private contradiction against public priority. The decision about the ampule arrives like a metronome. On a wooden box, 3 small glass vials rest in cotton. Morphine ampules, each counted. Each a promise. Each a scarcity. In quiet, Andrei holds one up to the light, finding the slight meniscus within. "We have 2 left," he says. "One to the private with the shrapnel, one to the sergeant." That's the table. Evelyn thinks of the man with the photograph whose breath has become a shallow thread. A soldier's insult might make him an enemy. A failing heart makes him human. If he goes into shock, he won't last until the convoy, she says. He won't last until anyone reaches him. The corporal at the door eyes them. "We've been ordered. No priority. Treat our own first." Andrei slides the ampule into a syringe with practiced hands and hands it to Evelyn. "Oath," he says, not loud, but with the kind of firmness that can carry discipline. Evelyn injects a small dose into the man's thigh, enough to ease the pain and steady the breathing, but not to deprive another of a life-saving measure later. It is a calculation made on a scalpel edge. Relieve suffering now and risk another life later, or deny relief and watch a human fold into silence under the weight of policy. The medicine itself is simple. The calculus is not. Morphine here is not just pharmacology. It is a moral instrument. To give it is to pronounce briefly and quietly that suffering matters without regard to uniform. Night stretches long and thin in the basement. The lamps hang lower. Someone has lashed a sheet across a beam to shield the wounded from falling dust. Evelyn sits on a low stool with a canteen cup warming between her hands and pulls the photograph from her pocket. The child on the paper smiles with the careless authority of childhood. At the back, scribbled in ink, a name. Lotta. She turns the paper over and finds, folded inside a cigarette packet, a scrap of writing in cramped German handwriting, an address, perhaps, or a folded letter that was never sent. Outside, a mortar drops and the whole church shudders. Within, a young private hums to himself as he tries to stitch a torn sleeve. A nurse across the row passes Evelyn a ration of biscuit, and nods toward the man with the photograph. "You keep his face," she says, voice small. "We keep the rest." Evelyn tucks the paper beside her ledger and writes a line. 2 hours and holding. Later, she will find herself tracing the crease with a thumb and imagining the child's small hand, the way a mother might map out the circumference of a life she might never meet. In the quiet, these small gestures, sharing a canteen, trading a blanket, keeping a photograph, are the scaffolding of care. They are not orders, they are not strategy, they are the social architecture that allows medicine to do its work. The nursing oath is an old phrase in a new place: to serve, to relieve, to witness. Under the churn of artillery and command, those words become instructions for how to keep being human. Confrontation arrives with the clack of boots and the thin authority of rank. A lieutenant from a nearby brigade appears at the stairwell, his coat dusted with the ash of burned doors. He stands with hands behind his back and looks over the rows as if he were inventorying supplies. "Who authorized this?" he asks, pointing with his chin at the man in the corner. "He is a prisoner. He will be processed. No priority." Evelyn meets his eyes. The armband on her arm feels like an anchor. "He's unstable," she says. "If we delay, he won't be processed anywhere." The lieutenant's jaw tightens. "Orders are orders. We cannot divert transport." Andre steps forward, voice steady but low. "Sir, 2 minutes. We can stabilize him enough to move. If you ask us to leave him, he will die minutes from now." There is a pause, the room holding its breath between the cadence of command and the murmur of care. Evelyn, with a hand that moves as if on its own, begins to shift stretchers, redirecting a line of men to another corner. The lieutenant's gaze follows the motion. In that motion, she buys a measure of time. Andre works with small hands and certain tools: a makeshift tourniquet, a careful dressing of a wound, a restrained dose of morphine, the knotting of bandage roll so it will not slip on the rough pallet. He speaks almost only to the patient in Polish, a language the lieutenant does not pass. Whether the words are apology or prayer is not clear, but the effect is the same. It is time bought. That bought time is not without cost. The men in the corridor grumble, an undercurrent of resentment about giving comfort to someone with the wrong flag on his sleeve. The lieutenant's report will be a line in a file. There is risk that the pair will be called to account. There is the more immediate risk that by using bandages and an ampule, they have reduced the available supply for someone else. Yet there is another ledger at work, the moral ledger that the oath inscribes. To treat the wounded regardless of uniform is not merely a legal nicety. It is a stabilizing act of civilization in a place otherwise ruled by rupture. Andre's hands move in the professionalism of someone who remembers trenches elsewhere, who knows that the alternative to care is a faster slide into chaos. Where command sees liability, the medic sees obligation. Where policy constructs categories, the practitioner must answer to a single, plain fact. There is a breathing human in front of me. The question of space on the convoy becomes the last arithmetic of the evening. When the signal comes that transport will evacuate at first light, the available space is counted like a ration. Men line up with wrapped limbs and scored papers in their pockets. There is one seat unspoken for, a place that will mean warmth and medical supervision for the one chosen. A young private, his cheek bruised but his heartbeat steady, claims it with the squat certainty of the wounded who have been told their names are the ones that matter. The prisoner, newly stabilized, is breathing more clearly but cannot sit without slipping into heavy sleep. Evelyn looks at the two men and then at the convoy manifest. She pictures the photograph again, Lotta's grin in the folded paper, and makes a choice that will be argued in mutters and perhaps later in a report. "He goes with us," she says. The private protests. Voices rise with the shamed heat of betrayal. "You can't put him there." "If you leave him, he'll die on the street," Evelyn answers. "We take both. One sits, one lies down. We travel together." The compromise is awkward, the German on the floor of the vehicle, the British private on the seat. There is a risk of reprisal, of a reprimand if the wrong superior notices. But there is also the saving calculus. 2 lives share one passage. As the convoy moves, a sergeant at the gate stoops to pick something on the ground and finds the photograph that has slipped again. He holds it, studies the smiling child, and for a moment, the fight leaves his face. He pins the paper to the man's coat without a word, hands tucked into his pockets, and the convoy pulls away. Each of these moments, picking up a photo, quietly injecting an ampule, shifting a stretcher to buy minutes, arranging space on a truck, reads as small and practical. But together, they form a steady argument. Medicine in war is not merely a profession of techniques. It is a practice of priorities that test the marrow of institutions. The armband might grant authority. The oath grants a different kind of power, that to put the patient before the label. The photograph is a pivot, a simple human mark that collapses abstraction into a face. In the church basement that week, Evelyn and Andre did not solve the war. They made a choice that preserved an immediate future for a man whose uniform would otherwise have been a sentence. They chose restraint, the strength of refusing to let orders be the only measure of action, and in that refusal, enacted a form of civilization under fire. The convoy's engine thrummed like a heartbeat as dawn light creased the sky. Inside the back of the truck, the air smelled of oil, wet wool, and the faint vinegar of antiseptic. The German lay on the floor between a folded blanket and a canvas pack, the photograph pinned to his chest by a strip of tape. He was quieter now, breathing with the regulated softness Andre had steadied him into. When he slept, his hand folded as if still holding the creased paper. The British private who occupied the seat watched him with the impatience of the wounded who have seen command make arithmetic of lives. At times, the private's jaw tightened. At others, he watched the photograph with something like curiosity. The truck jolted over a crater, and the German tipped his head, groaned, and clutched the photograph as if to make sure it had not been taken from him. The private exhaled and reached down to tuck an extra scarf under the German's neck. "Keep him warm," he said, voice flat. "Don't let him—" He stopped, the sentence collapsing into the rattle of the road. This small act inside a moving vehicle maps the daily compromises of a field hospital. Space in transport is a scarce commodity turned moral test. Who receives shelter? Who remains on the cold ground? Who shares a seat with a stranger? The private's hand was a minor mercy, but its consequence was not small. By softening the boundary between enemy and patient, the gesture reduced friction in a way orders could not. Mercies like scarves and shared space are micro-alliances. They do not overturn policy, but they preserve life in the margins where policy is blunt. For medical personnel, the practice of care continues in motion. Triage does not stop at the gate, and every item given, every inch of floor made softer, is an argument for the primacy of the patient. The convoy ground on, and the countryside slid by in green streaks. At a roadside checkpoint, a sergeant in a heavy coat stepped up to the truck to count papers and inspect tags. He crouched for a moment to examine the man on the floor. The photograph had slipped and lay face up. The sergeant's gloved fingers closed around the paper. He looked at the smiling child and then up at the German's face, which had a newly humanized softness now that someone had named a life rather than a uniform. The sergeant thumbed the corner of the photograph. Then, with a quick movement, he tucked it inside the man's tunic and straightened, saying nothing. When the convoy moved again, no one in the truck spoke about what transpired at the checkpoint. But the silence carried the weight of a decision made with no witness but the road. Checkpoints tidy danger into labels. People don't. The sergeant's small choice, tucking the photo back, protected a man more than any form. But that tidy system relies on human hands to carry it out, and those hands sometimes refuse the tidy cruelty of abstraction. The sergeant's private inspection was not a violation of duty so much as the quiet fulfillment of a different duty, seeing the person. At a bureaucratic level, a photograph is merely evidence. At a human level, it is a reminder. In field practice, recognition can change behavior. A tucked-in photograph is small concealment, but also a small act of protection. Where administration can make the enemy a file, the practical humanity of those on the ground restores a face. They arrived at the regimental clearing station, as smudged light grew warmer. The station was a swirl of stretchers and shouting clerks, a place where official processes attempted to reorder the chaos into transit. Papers were checked, a medic's pen slid across a sheet, and the German was assigned a tag with a crude number. A man with a red cross painted on his helmet from another unit pointed them to an earmarked tent where prisoners were to be kept until higher clearance could be obtained. Evelyn argued, softly but persistently, that he should remain under the medical tent for observation. A clerk tapped his fingers on the table and shrugged. "Orders say prisoners to the pen," he said. Andre held the man's hand, felt for warmth, then looked at Evelyn. "If we let them take him, we lose him," he said. Evelyn met the clerk's eyes and then the head nurse's. She gestured to the man's shallow breathing, the pallor that came when you asked a broken body to do too much. "We keep him here another day," she insisted. The head nurse, who had seen too many arguments and too many dead men left for order's sake, paused and then nodded. The prisoner remained in medical custody. The clipboard made it look simple, columns and codes. Evelyn watched the numbers march down the page and slid the prisoner's chart under a lamp, buying minutes the way she'd been doing all week, quietly, with paperwork. Field medicine must balance that procedural certainty with the immediate facts of the body in front of it. Keeping a prisoner under observation is not simply an act of defiance. It is a decision grounded in the plausibility that observation can change outcomes. When a hospital delays the transfer of a wounded person, it is practicing a precautionary principle: watch and act if the body demands. For Evelyn and Andre, holding a patient in the medical tent was a practical savings, time to monitor, to prevent shock, to discover complications that paperwork cannot predict. The act of delaying transfer suspended a bureaucratic momentum that would have made death convenient. At dusk, the German awoke enough to cradle the photograph and whisper a name. He could not form entire sentences, but the syllables that surfaced had a softness. Andre leaned close and listened, and by the cadence he guessed at the vowels. Evelyn pulled the cigarette packet from the sleeve, where she had tucked the scrap of folded paper, and unfolded the neat scrawl. The handwriting was a woman's hand, careworn in the loops, and on the envelope, a town name she half recognized from the maps pinned to the tent wall. The prisoner's lips shaped that town name and then, more clearly, Lotte. He stopped and smiled in a way that did not require translation. His eyes, for a sliver of time, became a room where a child's laughter echoed. This moment, the whispered name, the unfolding of a private letter, inserts the abstract into the diagonal of the particular. Medical work often confronts identity in fragments: a tag, a name, a photograph, a line of ink. Those fragments can bridge the gap between faceless enemy and human being with attachments. For the staff, a name softens an object. It invites empathy, not as sentimentality, but as recognition that motives and histories travel with wounded bodies. The discovery of a personal detail is not just human interest. It recalibrates risk assessments and alters triage decisions by providing a new set of stakes to consider. The tent became a fragile domesticity. Someone strung a blanket to make a private corner. A kettle boiled, and someone poured cups that steamed in the cool air. The British private sat on a crate near the German and, after long minutes, asked a question in a grudging manner. "Why a kid?" He did not look accusing. Instead, he seemed puzzled. Evelyn watched him and then picked up the photograph, held it out, and let him look. "Lotte," she said. "Or someone like her." The private's face slackened. The hardness eased as if the picture had translated an idea he had not known how to name. He reached out and laid his hand on the German's arm, a touch so ordinary it might have been mistaken for logistic adjustment. The German squeezed back, his eyelids closing. Human contact matters more than doctrine in moments like this. Touch conveys consent, compassion, and recognition. It also has measurable physiological effects, slowing heart rate, reducing panic, easing pain. Where orders legislate motion and placement, a hand can alter the body's trajectory. Practically, these touches create a bridge of trust that can reduce agitation and thereby reduce the need for chemical sedation. Ethically, They complicate the narrative of us versus them, placing the caregiver in the role of interpreter between personal attachment and military necessity. The following day, the field hospital received a fresh report. An incoming barrage had caused a civilian casualty in a nearby village, and among the rescued was a woman who claimed to know the child in the photograph. She arrived disoriented, carrying a muddied parcel and an air of grief belated with survival. Evelyn brought the image to her and watched as the woman's hands folded over the paper, and the name Lotta on the back drew a gasp of recognition. They could not confirm identity beyond the possibility of a familial link, but the woman spoke of a girl who had been evacuated earlier in a panic, who had been sent to relatives in a neighboring town. Her voice added a possible map to the photograph's life. The medical ledger recorded facts, vitals, tags, medications, but it also grew small new lines of human geography, a possible address, a remembered neighbor, a hope. These connections highlight how medical work on the front often becomes a node of social reconstruction. Field hospitals are not mere treatment centers. They are information hubs where fragments are assembled into narratives that may guide reunion, identification, or closure. When a nurse gathers the details of a civilian's memory and tacks it to a patient's file, she is practicing a larger social medicine, using clinical routines to restore social ties that war has torn. The photograph then becomes more than a sentimental object. It becomes a potential thread for reintegration. Yet the institutional pressure persisted. A supply officer came through the tents with a ledger and an air of procedural righteousness. He recorded how many bandage rolls had been used, how many ampules dispensed, and how many stretchers left the site. His pen moved with precise indifference. When he reached the entry for the prisoner's ampule, he paused and looked up at Evelyn. "These records are for accountability," he said. "You realize this will be flagged." Evelyn did not deny it. "We used what was necessary," she replied. "He might have died otherwise." The supply officer made a mark and moved on, but the implication remained. Choosing mercy carried administrative exposure. This exchange exposes the friction between clinical judgment and bureaucratic accounting. Records are vital. They prevent waste and fraud, and in war, they are the thread by which resources are stretched across many hands. But rigid accounting does not always accommodate necessary deviations. The medical choice to allocate scarce resources to an enemy is visible on the ledger and thus subject to scrutiny. Practitioners accept this visibility because the duty to the patient is immediate and irreducible. Their judgments are therefore both practical and sacrificial. Practical because they preserve life, sacrificial because they invite censure. As the station prepared to forward wounded to a rear hospital, word came that a senior officer would inspect the site. Rumors circulated that any irregularities would be punished. The rumble of that possibility sharpened the nerves of everyone on duty. Evelyn and Andre sat opposite each other under the tent's canvas, the armband on her sleeve and the stain of boot polish on his cuff. "If he is taken and someone decides he is expendable," Andre began. He did not finish. The image of a man's silhouette being handed over into an uncertain fate was an open question. Evelyn folded the photograph and placed it inside her apron pocket. "Then we have done our part," she said. "We made the decision while he was in our care." They did not speak of the risk of formal reprimand. The possibility of censure existed as a background pressure they had to carry like a damp coat. The tension between personal responsibility and institutional repercussion is a lived reality for many medics and nurses. They operate where moral agency and administrative accountability collide. A nurse's decision can be both a lifesaver and a career risk. Still, most practitioners accept that the immediate moral calculus, what the body needs now, has primacy. The profession's internal ethics demand that contingency. The oath functions as a priority override when other systems fail to account for the immediate human stakes. On the road back, a shell burst on a ridge, and the truck's occupants were thrown forward. The German's grip on the photograph faltered and it skated across the floor. Evelyn lunged and caught it mid-slide, preserving the crease and the child's smile. She held the paper out, and the man's eyes opened with a clarity that startled everyone. He whispered a name and, with hands that trembled, reached for a small token in his pocket. A scrap of fabric embroidered with a child's initials. He showed it to the private, who looked at it as if seeing a relic. Tears began, then stopped, and the men looked away in unison. Objects in war carry disproportionate meaning. A scrap of cloth or a photograph becomes a talisman against erasure. For caregivers, preserving those talismans is part of preserving the person. When Evelyn saved the photograph from sliding out of reach, she was not merely saving paper. She was preserving an anchor for a life. That act is both practical, comforting the patient, and symbolic, asserting that identity matters. Objects can be small instruments of survival. A remembered name can steady a breathing rhythm. A photograph can focus attention away from panic. At the rear hospital, the prisoner received more thorough treatment. Surgeons opened gauze, washed wounds, and noted infections. He stabilized over days. André and Evelyn visited when they could, and each visit revealed small advances. Better color in the cheeks, a flicker of recognition when someone recited the girl's name, a clearer grip on the photograph. One afternoon, as Evelyn sat by his bed threading a needle to mend a sleeve, he placed the photograph in her hand and mouthed one word that she recognized from his earlier whisper, "Danke." She smiled and nodded. "You're welcome," she answered in English. André translated into Polish for the man. The exchange did not erase the war, it threaded a human moment through it. The ongoing care at a rear facility illustrates how initial acts of mercy ripple outward. Stabilization in the field buys time for more complete interventions later. When medics choose to treat beyond immediate allegiances, they invest in the possibility of recovery that can only be realized in a better-equipped setting. Moreover, the reciprocity that sometimes results, the simple gratitude of a patient, complicates wartime narratives and underlines that the practice of medicine can produce unexpected social capital. Back in the church basement that had become her unofficial office, Evelyn wrote into the margin of her ledger with a pencil that had more smudge than lead. She recorded the patient number and the ampule dispensed. Then beneath the official line, she added in smaller script, "Photograph saved. Possible victim's name Lotta. Recommended follow-up." The ledger was both a clinical document and a moral diary. When later she slipped the photograph into the pages of her personal journal, she did so as both evidence and talisman, a refusal to fully surrender the human story to bureaucracy. Keeping informal records, and sometimes secreting personal notes, is a quiet practice among caregivers. Official documents must stand up to inspection, but personal entries preserve the subjective truth of care, the moments of doubt, the gestures of courage, the small human elements that formal systems flatten. These marginal notes are how practitioners remember why they acted a certain way. They are also a condensed language of conscience that may serve future reconciliation or testimony. The weeks that followed were uneven. Some convoys took wounded eastward, some men returned to frontline duties, some names disappeared from the ledger. The story of the photographs circulated in whisper more than in reports. A nurse here, a medic there, speaking of a child's smile kept safe in the folds of a pocket. The return on that whisper was not immediate justice. It was instead a chain of small protections, an extra blanket here, a discreet shift of a stretcher there, a delayed transfer that allowed a wound to close enough for travel. Each act compounded into a pattern that, in its modesty, constituted resistance to the totalizing logic of war. Patterns of small mercy are cumulative. While no single gesture may change the outcome of a campaign, their aggregation creates a social climate where restraint becomes normative among practitioners. This does not mean that military objectives are abandoned. It means that within those objectives a humane practice can be sustained. When medics and nurses repeatedly prioritize care over categorization, they exert a corrective force against the mechanical dehumanization that war otherwise impels. In late autumn, when frost began to lace the mornings and supply lines shifted, a letter arrived for the unit. It was addressed in handwriting Evelyn recognized, the cramped script from the cigarette packet, and inside was a single line confirming that a child named Lotta had been located with distant relatives and had been kept safe during an evacuation. The letter carried more uncertainty than closure, but for the staff, it was proof that small acts could reach beyond immediate survival. They could, in rare cases, reconnect lives. Evelyn folded the letter into her journal beneath the photograph and left it there like a small monument. The discovery of a possible reunion is a rare payoff for wartime caregiving, but such payoffs carry immense moral significance. They validate the risk taken and transform acts of compassion into social repair. That validation is not universal nor guaranteed, yet when it occurs, it binds the caregiver to a larger narrative of human recovery that can outlast the immediate exigencies of conflict. Through all of this, Andre and Evelyn continued their routine, shifting stretchers, counting bandage rolls, whispering doses of morphine into waiting syringes, and keeping watch at the side rooms where men murmured in languages not always shared. Their gestures became steady as a ritual. They sometimes argued about procedure, sometimes about whether a bandage should be used here or there, and sometimes they simply sat in silence, the armband and the ampule between them, like liturgies of a small church of care. Rituals in a field hospital are stabilizing. They reduce anxiety by providing predictable steps in an unpredictable environment. The bandage roll unwound in a practiced hand is an incantation against chaos. For practitioners, rituals reconnect the technical with the humane, converting the repetition of tasks into a moral architecture where the oath is embodied in repeated, careful acts. One night, as frost formed like lace on the window slats, a new man was brought in, a young enemy soldier, barely more than a boy, whose name was unknown and whose hands bled from an arm wound that had been crudely bound in the field. He whimpered when moved, and someone near the doorway remarked, aloud and bitterly, "Too young." Evelyn adjusted the dressings and found herself humming under her breath the tune the Polish para had sung the first night she saw them arrive. The boy's breath evened. Andrzej pressed a clean cloth to his forehead and watched him sleep. Later, when he checked the dressing, he found that the child clutched the small scrap of cloth Evelyn had used as padding. He stared at that scrap as if he had found an unexpected relic. "We keep him," Andrzej said, "because it is what we do." When faced repeatedly with a choice, repetition itself becomes the declaration of an ethic. Each time a nurse tends to the young and to the old without regard to their banner, the habit strengthens. Habits are the other language of oaths. They translate principle into action and action into culture. In that way, the simple refrain, "We keep him," is less a slogan than a practice that conditions behavior across a unit. Months later, when reports and after-action reviews lined up in neat stacks and the shape of the campaign became clearer, the story of one photograph remained modestly present in the files of those who kept copies of personal journals. Not every narrative reached headquarters. Not every small resistance was recorded in formal dispatches. Yet for those who had been there, the image of a child's grin folded into a battered pocket was a stubborn emblem, a reminder that the work of medicine often required courage that borders bureaucracy. It is a particular kind of courage to act with restraint, refusing the easy escalation of violence in favor of a careful withholding that preserves another life. The nurse's armband and the medic's oath do different work. One signals authority, the other prescribes conduct. In the basement of the church and in the moving truck, those two marks met and sometimes conflicted. The choice to prioritize the oath transformed objects into instruments of mercy. Across these small decisions, the practical reality remains. Medicine does not exist in a vacuum. Supplies run low, convoys are scheduled, and orders cascade down the chain of command. Yet within this structure, practitioners are not passive executors. They are agents who can interpret, delay, and sometimes defy directives when survival, humanity, and professional duty align. The photograph in the pocket was not a plan, it was a catalyst. It forced a recalibration of priorities and revealed that the oath of medicine can be stronger than the force of orders. By the time winter deepened, the photograph had been copied into a small circle of notebooks, an image retold as proof that compassion can survive the strangest conditions. Evelyn and Andrzej continued their work, not always lauded, not always understood but steady. The field hospital kept treating, counting and choosing. And the patient who had once been a question on a pallet lived long enough to see spring begin to thaw the ruts in the road. If you were in that basement, would you have chosen the oath or the orders? Tell me in the comments. And if you want another true wartime choice that hinged on a single object, stay with me for the next story.